What does power look like when it moves outside the law a little bit or more? That's the question that frames this conversation with Geoffrey Kelly, a retired FBI agent with more than 3 decades in state and federal law enforcement. Geoffrey was one of the original members of the FBI's elite art crime team, recovering over $100 million in stolen art and cultural property during his career. In this episode, we step into a rarely visible side of the watch world. Not auctions or collections, but investigations. We explore how luxury goods operate inside illicit networks and why objects like watches and other luxury objects often reveal things that financial records alone cannot. As Geoffrey explains, luxury watches move easily across borders. They compress value. They signal trust, reward, and status. And in a world of shadow markets and informal power systems, they can function as currency, collateral, or symbolic payment. We talk about why watches are particularly attractive within illicit value systems, how they circulate through criminal, gray, and semi-legitimate spaces, and how their movement complicates enforcement, recovery, and regulation. This conversation also challenges common assumptions, what the public misunderstands about luxury and crime, why prestige objects matter in investigations, and how power expresses itself through material culture, even when it operates outside formal institutions. This episode isn't about scandals, it's about structure. So stay with us, because when watches appear in criminal cases, they're rarely just accessories, they're signals. All right, everyone, welcome to this week's episode on Watches and Politics, where I have the utmost honor to interview Mr. Geoff Kelly, who is a retired FBI special agent with many years of experience in crimes that involve luxury goods and art. He's one of the founders of the elite FBI team of Stolen Art Crime Division. And I'm very happy to talk with him today. One of the things that we as watch collectors and educators in this field constantly talk about is how watches are being used for illicit gains, or how watches are being used for other things. In the first series, I speak about watches of power, where I talk a lot about diplomatic gifts and how watches were used for diplomatic gifts. But then I talk about also about some scandals that involve watches, especially in politics. Well, Geoff is an expert on luxury and art, especially. I invited him today to speak as the utmost expert on that field. Geoff, thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and welcome to Watches and Politics.
Thank you, Eddie. My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So I always like to start with the first question, the same for all the guests, and that is, when you hear about watches and politics, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
I think, you know, when I think about watches, I think there's so much more than just a timekeeping device. You know, I think watches are really they're a manifestation of power. They say a lot about the individual that wears a particular watch. And I think sometimes people are judged specifically by the type of watch that they're wearing. So I think there's a lot. There's a lot of depth to the choice of timepiece. So I can definitely see a correlation between politics and power and the choice of wristwatch that someone chooses to wear.
Now, I want to learn more. How do luxury goods function inside illicit networks, or in your experience? Luxury goods, art, and these pieces that happen to have high value.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, you know, we were talking when we were talking about doing this. I explained to you, I've never worked one of a stolen watch case. One of my colleagues, and you know, as you mentioned, I retired from the FBI. It's coming up on 2 years now. It goes so quickly. And one of my colleagues, KT Newton, who works with my company that we started, Argus Cultural Property Consultants. It's a consulting firm. She was a federal prosecutor in Philadelphia, and she actually had a case involving an individual who was engaging in selling counterfeit Rolexes and selling counterfeit parts for Rolexes, and it was about a $750,000 scheme. This is back in 2022, and one thing that this individual Dmitry Hajiv was doing was using it for illicit gains, money laundering. When you're talking about stolen high-end goods, and watches are no exception, it touches upon all aspects of criminality. You're getting into money laundering, you're getting into structuring, which is making deposits or currency transactions that are just below the $10,000 reporting threshold. You're getting into drug trafficking. Objects as portable and as small as wristwatches can be used as collateral in drug transactions. We see it when we're talking about high-end art. The difference between high-end art and watches is well-known artwork is just, it's by its very definition, it's just too well known to be worked into the illicit legal art market, and it always has to kind of stay on the periphery. Whereas when you're talking about watches, well, certainly a lot of high-end watches have serial numbers. When you're selling watches that don't have the documentation, you're selling a Rolex, it doesn't have the case in which it was purchased, it doesn't have the documentation that underlies it, then it becomes anonymous, and then it's easy for it to be trafficked as stolen property, or in the case of Hajiv, counterfeit parts are being substituted on legitimate timepieces.
Well, that's very interesting, but a lot of things very fast. Now, we
Let's
as
break it down. Let's break it down.
now we as watch collectors, for example, or as people that would listen that like art or like luxury goods such as watches, how could these be used on those illicit or criminal things that you just mentioned? And you don't have to stick to watches. Like, for example, for art, how could that be used? You said drug trafficking and then structuring. Can you break it down for us a little bit, please?
Yeah. So let's take high end art when we're talking about drug trafficking, since we're using that as an example, right? You're going to a bad actor is going to do a deal for $10 million of illicit drugs, and he has to have some type of collateral. $10 million in cash is going to represent you're talking about a van full of cash, whereas you could have a Van Gogh or a Rembrandt, just one piece that can act as the collateral for a particular deal. We see it a lot in money laundering, right? So in the United States, we have the Bank Secrecy Act, and it was implemented about 50 years ago to prevent money laundering. And what it basically says is, there's a lot of parts to it, but the relevant parts say that financial institutions have a legal obligation to identify clients who are potentially engaging in some type of money laundering activity. And they have a legal obligation to bring it to the attention of the authorities, whether it's the FBI or the IRS. The art market, even though it's a 60 to $80 billion a year market, in the United States, the art market does not fall under the governance of the Bank Secrecy Act, which means they don't have a legal obligation to notify the authorities of any transactions that occur over $10,000, whereas a financial institution does. Any transaction over $10,000 generates what's called a CTR, a currency transaction report. Or if they see something that looks a little suspicious, something that maybe it's involving money laundering. There's something that's going, or structuring intentionally, scheduling financial transactions to stay below that $10,000 threshold. A bank, financial institution, has to generate a suspicious activity report, SAR. Again, auction houses, galleries are not under the same legal obligation as the way it stands now. And the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Enablers Act, these are legislation that has been proposed in Congress to try and close this loophole to hold auction houses and art galleries to the same standard, because really, in effect, they do act as financial institutions. Some of the larger auction houses actually have financial arms, and what they do is they act as banks. They act as financial institutions. They give credit, they issue loans, but they're not governed by the Bank Secrecy Act. And so I'm giving all this as a background to basically say that if you had a bad actor, let's say a drug trafficker, and he has $100 million in illicit proceeds from the drug business, he is, and he has to figure out how to launder that money, right? I loved watching Breaking Bad. It's one of my favorite shows, and Ozark. And you have the character, whether it's in Breaking Bad or Ozark, you have the main character in this horrible quandary that you've gained all this cash, and now how do you clean it? And whether it's opening a car wash or a strip club or whatever, there's all these machinations that you're trying to go through to try and cleanse this money. But the art market is just so enticing, because with my scenario, you have a drug trafficker with $100 million in cash, and conceivably he could go to an auction house and bid anonymously on a Van Gogh that's coming up for auction, and he could buy it for $100 million. And the auction house is under no legal obligation to notify the FBI about this $100 million transaction from a guy who backed up a van to the loading dock filled with cash. Moral obligation, ethical obligation. Yes, I'm not suggesting that auction houses would be intentionally involved in such duplicitous and nefarious activity. I'm just giving an example, of course, and there's varying degrees of culpability. But this individual could then buy that Van Gogh for $100 million, take it, put it in a free house, like in Geneva, where he wouldn't have to pay taxes on it, and he's essentially cleansed $100 million in illegal drug proceeds. And the kicker is, not only has he cleansed the money, he now has a piece of artwork that's right now is valued at $100 million. He'll hold on to it for a few years in that free house, and then he's going to sell it through anonymously through an auction. And another drug trafficker is going to buy it 5 years from now for $300 million. So not only did he cleanse that initial $100 million, he just made $200 million in profit off of the drug proceeds. And again, I'm giving kind of like hit you over the head examples, but that is basically how money laundering works when you're talking about the art market. It's not regulated to the extent that it really needs to be regulated when you're talking about such high-end pieces of artwork and such financial transactions that are just so astronomical. And I may be a little bit cynical because I've been doing this for so long, but when I hear about some piece of artwork that's coming up for a big piece that's coming up for an auction, and the estimate is $20 million, and the hammer price ends up being well over $100 million, the cynic in me says that there must have been a bidding war between two drug dealers, is trying to launder their illicit funds. So, and I'm again not suggesting that that's what's happening, but it's the potential is there, and on a smaller scale, we see a lot of money laundering through the use of art purchases.
So here we're talking all about assumptions, of course,
Right.
and no particular house or particular pieces or anything. But we're just trying to understand and maybe educate the listeners about different ways that also these goods could be used, because we hear a lot of thinks about art and watches being used for illicit gains, and that is why we're talking with an expert on that. But that is something interesting because some friends of mine, they have just published like a few minutes ago actually one of the reports of the latest auctions in watches, and this year the highest watches that were sold, one was sold for $17 million, the other one for $12 million, 11, 8, 6. So, and these are interesting, of course, pieces with a provenance, with an interesting provenance. But when you hear those numbers in auctions about watches, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, everything we talked about is hypothetical worst case scenario, and I don't, and you
Of
know,
course,
the caveat, I'm not suggesting that any major auction houses are engaging in anything nefarious, um, but yeah, when you hear about something like this, I mean, it certainly makes you wonder. But from a less nefarious standpoint, of course, they're investments, right? And if I told you 30 years ago that I've come up with this idea for an invisible item called a Bitcoin, and I want you to give me $50,000 for one. I mean, you would laugh at it. And now they're obviously the cyber currency is a huge part of our economy, and so it doesn't really matter, right? When you're talking about investment, when you're talking about high-end objects, whether you buy this watch at auction, and let's take away anything illegal, right? Let's just say you have a lot of money and you want a safe place to park your money. You're concerned about what's going to happen with the market. You don't worried about real estate. You go buy a watch that you say it's now worth $17 million. It's not, right? I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder. But if you're willing to pay $17 million for that watch, you've now just set the market for that particular timepiece and any other timepieces that were produced by the same manufacturer, same style, in the same year. Now that's a $17 million watch because you paid $17 million for it, and you have a very, you're rest assured that when you decide to sell it in 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be substantially more. It's not going to sell for $2 million. And so it's a smart investment tool because it's never going to drop in value, in my opinion. But also because you're now setting the market on this particular item. And if it is for nefarious purposes, and I'm not suggesting it is, you've just managed to cleanse $17 million in whatever illicit proceeds that you've accumulated. Again, hypothetically, right? So it's a smart tool that can be used. It can be used legally as a smart investment, but bad actors can use it as a way to cleanse money that's been ill-gotten gain.
and I'm wondering, when investigators encounter luxury items during an investigation, what do those objects often reveal that bank records alone do not?
Yeah, no, I mean, I look at that. I look at substitute assets when I see something like that. If I'm investigating somebody for some type of illegal activity, um, and we have frequently working these types of investigations that I worked, art theft investigations and money laundering investigations, frequently come upon watch collections, right? And oftentimes the watches in their collection are worth as much or even more than the house in which these guys are living, right? Because it's a smart place to keep your money. If you're engaging in illegal activity, putting that money in a bank account sets up a lot of red flags, as we just talked about a few minutes ago. Currency transaction reports and suspicious activity reports will find their way onto the desk of FBI agents or IRS agents. Um, you have these watches. You can easily have $1 million in watches in a home safe, which is better than trying to keep $1 million in a safe at home. And a lot of times, investigators don't know the true value of watches. I mean, we were just talking about the astronomical sums that some of these watches have fetched at auction, but not even at auction. I mean, sure, everybody knows about Rolexes and Pateks, but there's so many other watches out there, especially when you're getting into vintage watches that have such high value that it's a great place to hold on to your money rather than putting it in a bank where it could be seized by the government.
So, speaking, of course, hypothetically, what characteristics would make watches particularly attractive in this age where the value of luxury watches has skyrocketed within illicit value systems compared to other luxury goods?
Yeah, I mean, there's a portability about watches, which
Mhm.
is what shares the same characteristics of artwork, that it can be easily transported from place to place. But there's this ambiguity when it comes to the value of a watch, right? I mean, certainly a collector is going to be able to look at a particular watch and have an estimate of its value. But in terms of everyday investigators, not having an idea about just how much this watch is worth and how much it represents when you're talking about trying to park your money somewhere safer. Um, and again, we talked about it earlier. When you're talking about art theft, and this is it's one of the biggest ironies about the fine art market when you're talking about stolen artwork is those high end pieces just they can't be they can't be sold. We talk about art thefts. There's very little recidivism when you're talking about art thieves. You steal a valuable piece, you're expecting when you're if you steal television sets, you steal cars, whatever, you're expecting to get 10 cents on the dollar, and you see a piece in a museum that might be worth $100 million. You're thinking, you're doing the math and you're like, wow, it's $10 million, right? But you can't move it. Stealing it's the easy part. It's monetizing it. It's getting money out of this, and that's the hard part, right? And these pieces are just too recognizable. We talk about the Gardner Museum, which is the case that I had for 22 years, and those pieces could never be introduced in the legitimate art market. Um, I mean, forget about the fact that so many people on the street would know it, but certainly anybody in an auction setting or in a gallery setting would recognize the concert or Lady and Gentleman in Black or the Storm immediately. So they can't be monetized. They can't be reintroduced into the licit, not the illicit, the licit art market. And so they're practically worthless. Though the same can't be said for watches, right? I mean, there's so many online marketplaces where you can buy high-end watches, Rolexes, Omegas, and Panerais, and uh, you're taking a risk that you're going to get a watch that's going to be legitimate and hasn't been stolen, hasn't been doctored, hasn't been forged. There's the case that I mentioned that my colleague worked on. This individual was taking legitimate customer Rolexes, and then he was substituting counterfeit parts in the watch. How would you ever know? I mean, I mean, I have a Rolex. I have a Submariner. It's gone out 3 times for service. I've had it almost 40 years, and I've only had it serviced by Rolex. But you let that watch go, and God knows what parts are in it when it comes back. And in this case, in Philadelphia, that's exactly what happened. That these parts were being cannibalized and replaced with inferior counterfeit parts.
You mentioned about these art pieces being too hot to move them.
Yeah.
Uh, so then, what what uh, do they serve for, or how are they used in the underground crime, for example? And I'm asking these things because there might be some very high end watches, one of ones, for example, that uh, fast so much, and when they If they are stolen, then that would have a similar story, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about artwork, I mentioned about being used as collateral. What often happens when high end artwork is stolen is it just kind of floats around for a while. Initially the thieves think that they're going to make some money off of this. They're going to be able to monetize it. They can't, and then it just kind of lingers. And can be used in collateral on drugs. It can be used to pay off loans and whatnot. But for the most part, they just kind of linger and they hang around. It's not uncommon many years later to see paintings quietly returned to the museums because there's just no market for it and it becomes a liability. And that's why if you look art theft, while the things like the Garden Museum, these are the ones that catch all the headlines, of course, and with good reason. It's very Hollywood, but it's not really indicative of the art market, the stolen art market. Most of the pieces that are stolen are lesser known pieces, of course, high quality pieces, but they're not top. They're not the Van Goghs, the Rembrandts, uh, Picassos, Warhols. It's the lesser known pieces that kind of make their way in, but even that is becoming more and more difficult now that smartphones, right? You can take your smartphone and just point it in an object and Google search, and it'll tell you everything about that piece. And if it's been reported stolen anywhere, or certainly if you thinking about buying a piece and you put your camera on it, it tells you that it's supposed to be in a collection of a museum somewhere. That's a warning sign, right? And when I say supposed to be, um, that here in the United States, from I was on the art crime team, as you mentioned, since it was formed in 2004, and I tell you that 80% of all art that's stolen in the United States is stolen from private residences. Out of that remaining 20% that is stolen from museums, 80% of that uh, is stolen from insiders, museum employees, someone on the inside. And so it's typically not going to be the items on the walls. That's too easy, right? It's going to be the items that are down in storage. And if when you think about a museum, a museum's collection is really like an iceberg. And what you see out on the gallery walls and in the galleries is a fraction of what many museums actually have in their collections. And these items may be in those collections for decades. We saw it in London with a curator, this guy Latchford, who was over a period of years was pilfering objects from the collections, and a lot of that occurs because of misplaced trust that museums bestow upon their employees. They don't have the protocols in place to prevent something like that from happening. So you're going to see it. You're going to see it more with artwork. But getting back to the original point about watches, I could take a Google image of my Submariner, right, and it's just going to say that it's a Rolex Submariner. If it was stolen, it's not gonna identify that. And so because of that, it's easier for that to get reintroduced into the legitimate watch market, watch and jewelry market. And that's one of the concerns when you're looking at stolen objects. And because of the and I and getting back to artwork in general, when we're talking about that, it's you're seeing a trend now towards jewels, right? You saw it in Dresden in 2019. Obviously, we saw it a few months ago with the Louvre. That jewels are much easier to move than the paintings on the walls because, of course, they can be broken down, the gems can be recut, the settings can be melted down, and then it can be reintroduced, um, which is a tragedy, right? Because you take a 100 carat stone, which is just incredibly valuable, and then you break it down into 101 carat stones. Um, Forget about the historical importance of that piece, just the fact that all the 100 1-carat stones is nothing compared to a 100-carat stone, right? So
I read this and I wanted to ask you if it is true that some paintings, and there was this rumor that for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, some paintings were used in the underground world for crime families to also flex that they have this painting or something. Are these only urban legends, or are you aware that there some crime families or crime bosses, they use them as a power flex?
you know, Eddie, I haven't seen that, and I've worked art thefts for a long time, but I'm not going to sit here and say it's never happened because that would be reckless on my part. But I've never seen that happen. There's a reason why there's this expression that there's no honor among thieves, right? I think
Okay.
it's virtually impossible to find any criminal enterprise that's operating, whether it's here in the United States or abroad, in which law enforcement hasn't infiltrated it to some degree, right? It's
Mhm.
just the way it is, and it's the downfall. It's the Achilles heel of every criminal enterprise. Um, every RICO organization, of course, RICO, racketeering influence, corrupt organization, a organization that comes together for the purpose of committing unlawful activity, they're always infiltrated because somebody's going to see a way that they can make a few bucks by turning in their friends or reporting on
Wow.
what their friends are doing, or somebody gets, what we say, jammed up. Somebody gets arrested for something, and then they have a bargaining chip. Is they can give you the bigger fish, right? So I've never seen it. I've never, there's so much Hollywood
Of course.
mystique that goes around when we're talking about art theft. But yeah, I would, if somebody was doing it, they probably wouldn't be doing it for long before the police are going to come in and seize whatever they're claiming that they've got up on the walls.
So, Jeff, in your view, where are the biggest regulatory or enforcement blind spots today? I think we talked about how auction houses and galleries, they don't need to maybe declare the where those resources come. But when it comes to luxury goods and financial crimes, what are other maybe regulatory blind spots that you see?
Yeah, look, it's gonna be the internet. I mean, that's the huge blind spot. There's just so much of it going on, um, and I'm not saying all illegal. I mean, it's a huge, obviously it's a huge platform for peer-to-peer commerce, and it's impossible to stay on top of all of it. There's so much of it occurring every day, and it crosses borders, and it's difficult to find jurisdiction. And sometimes you have agencies, international agencies, fighting over one particular crime activity, and then in other situations, it's kind of like, well, nobody knows who's actually got the jurisdiction, and it can be difficult. Here in the United States, we have judicial districts. I want to say there's like 92. I'm guessing. Um, but basically, basically every state has a federal judicial district, and some larger states like Florida, New York, California have multiple ones. And each judicial district has a United States attorney that's appointed, uh, and he or she is in charge of that particular district. So that's where their jurisdiction extends into the borders of their judicial district. And so when you have activity that's occurring outside of this district, it can be difficult to try and figure out who's going to prosecute it, or can anyone prosecute it. And when it's international, there's always a difficulty when you're getting into international crime of finding who's going to be the appropriate agency or who's going to be the appropriate entity or country to prosecute it. And these are there's it was an issue when I started in the FBI and I started working telemarketing fraud. And a lot of my subjects, the bad guys, were up in Canada, and they were doing this internationally and calling down to U.S. citizens. uh, that was kind of like the nascent stages of international fraud. And now with the internet and how we have one global economy, it can be anywhere. It can be anywhere in the world, and it's very difficult because, especially when you have, say, uh, con men, fraudsters who were in Nigeria, right, and they're committing fraud against individuals who are here in the United States. That can be difficult because without the cooperation and the buy-in from Nigerian law enforcement authorities, they can really operate with impunity. And so it's important when you have, especially in like this type of situation, where you have a lot of coordination between countries to go after people who are committing fraud internationally. It's not easy. You know, I'm a lot of ways I'm glad to be retired because when my first 5 years in the FBI, I was working white collar crime, economic crime, and back then, if a victim paid cash or she paid a check, it would actually be cash, right? Pays check to a bad guy. Well, I'd get that check and turn it over, and I could see what the bank account was, and then I would subpoena that bank account and I'd know who the guy was. That's how you identify him. And maybe if he was really tricky, he would take the money from there and put it in a second bank account, or maybe even a third. But you would be able to manage that, right? If you have to subpoena one, two, or three bank accounts, eventually you're going to find the guy who's behind it all. But of course, with online banking, I mean, you wire money to somebody, and in a second, it's traveled between it's bounced off of 100 different bank accounts in 100 different countries, and it's very difficult to stay on top of it and to actually find the originating bad actor. It's very complicated. There's no easy answers to it.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. And this has been an amazing and very educational interview. But finally, I also want to ask you, what do you think the public most misunderstands about how luxury, crime, and power intersect with each other?
Yeah, look, I think when you're talking about the theft of high-end objects like artwork, there's always going to be the Thomas Crown affair um, ideology, right? That it's this ideal that it's um, wealthy collectors who are taking these objects because they love them so much, and they 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 have to possess them, and that's kind of a Hollywood sensibility. These guys are criminals, whether it's high-end watches or Rembrandts. These guys are in it to make a buck, and if there's a way to do it, right, whether it's jewel theft that you can break down or stolen watches that you can counterfeit the underlying documentation, um, or paintings, whatever there is, if there's a way to make a buck off it, they're going to try and do it. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the subjects who are involved in high end art and jewelry theft is that they're somehow on an elevated level than other criminals, and it's at the end at the end it's all the same. It's just a way to make some money.
Do you think there are perfect fugitives, perfect crime?
Oh yeah, I mean, listen, yeah, and the perfect crimes are the ones you never hear about, right?
Oh,
That's really what it is. Um,
but you wrote a book about 13 perfect fugitives. So we've heard about them.
Perfect crime, but there are perfect fugitives. Yeah. So, so I have a book coming out in March on the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft, which I was the lead investigator for 22 years, right up until my retirement. And the title of the book uh, basically comes to the idea, the methodology that I used when I got this case. And the heist occurred in 1990. I got the case in 2002, so it was already um, been around for a dozen years. And the statute of limitations, which is the period in which you can charge somebody with a crime, for the robbery of the museum is 5 years. So in March of 1995, the statute of limitations expired. So when I got the case in 2002, even if I was able to identify at the time the individuals who robbed the museum, I wouldn't have been able to charge them because the statute had expired. So I chose to work this investigation not like a typical stolen property case. I thought it would be more beneficial to work it as a fugitive investigation, right? Which is when I've worked fugitives, and I worked a number of fugitives, publicity is the key, right? And that's how I worked the garden investigation. We did a lot of publicity. We did billboard campaigns. We did videos. You can go to the FBI website, and there's links to various videos that we produced. Because my attitude then, and I still think it was a viable attitude, investigative strategy, was to get the public on our side. Maybe somebody will see something. And the reason why I called them perfect fugitives is because, unlike their human counterparts who they've got to go see the doctor, they get toothaches, they got to pay rent, they got to go to the store, they got to get haircuts. I mean, all the things that trip up real fugitives, human fugitives. My fugitives didn't have that problem. They could just be hidden away somewhere. And so that's what made them so difficult to catch. But yeah, so thank you. But that's the reasoning behind the title of the book.
I can't wait to read it. It's
Well, thank you.
definitely one of the one of the cases that is in everyone's mouths and in ears, and everybody wants to hear good news that those beautiful paintings of those fugitives will come back to their home, and who else is better to tell their story for over years and someone like you that you have worked on it.
Well, thank you, Eddie.
Um,
They will be apprehended. They will. Eventually. History shows that. But yeah.
so why uh, you talked about statute of limitation, and that is so they are stolen.
Yeah.
So if they are recovered, then the people that did the crime, if they are alive, they won't be charged.
So there's two points. You bring up a great point. So the
Yeah, and I'm sorry, please don't mind my ignorance. It's just
no,
that
no, no, not at all. And I listen, that's an excellent point that you bring up. So the theft occurred on March 18th of 1990. For the robbery, it's a 5-year statute of limitations. Expired in March of 1995. In the United States, there is no statute of limitations for possession of stolen property. That's part of our national property laws. So, and it makes sense, right? I mean, I couldn't go steal your car and keep it in my garage for 5 years, and then the next, 5 years in a day, I go and register it and say, "Sorry, Eddie, it's my car now." So you can never, in the United States, you could never have clear title to stolen property. It will always the victim uh, rights to that property will trump anyone else's. But that's not the same in other countries. Some other countries, if you purchase property in good faith, it's yours now. Some countries, if it changes hands 2 times, but in the United States, you can never have clear title to stolen property. So that's the reason, because of that possession of stolen property. That's the reason why the FBI still has jurisdiction and continues to work the case. One of the difficulties and one of the reasons why I argued that we should really be working this case like a fugitive investigation is the fact that possession of stolen property is part of our National Stolen Property Act. It is a specific intent crime. And what does that mean? It means you have to have knowledge that the property is stolen, right? A specific intent. If I go rob a bank, the government doesn't have to prove that I knew it was a bank. It's a bank and I robbed it. I committed the crime. But when you're talking about possession of stolen property, the government has to be able to prove intent. They have to be able to prove that you knew it was stolen, right? And that makes sense. Can you imagine if you went to a reputable art gallery and you bought a piece and you paid market value and you got all your receipts, and the next day the FBI showed up to say you're under arrest because this painting is stolen? Well, that wouldn't be right, because you didn't know. You didn't have the knowledge that it was stolen. Maybe the gallery owner did, or maybe he or she didn't. So that's the reason why the FBI has basically a dog in this fight. But that's a really difficult thing to prove, to be able to get into somebody's mind. And so when the FBI, and this goes for, I worked art theft cases for more than 2 decades, and when you're working them, you have to be able to prove that the person who's selling that piece of artwork, or the person that's got that piece of artwork, that he or she knows that it's stolen. And so that's a high hurdle to overcome. And we would typically do it by trying to introduce an undercover, or have an informant who's wearing a wire, who would be able to have a conversation with the person, or something that he or she would make statements or write emails or something that would give that necessary element of the statute the knowledge. So yeah, so that's how we still work it. So it's really two different investigations. So
What about if somebody just inherited from their grandfather who stole, who was the thief in the Stuart Museum?
no, they wouldn't be charged, but they'd have to give it back. But
Yeah.
with a $10 million reward, that's a hell of an incentive to give it back. And so,
Mm.
that's funny. I've um, I've heard, when they talk about the paintings, and you throw these numbers around. Like right now, they're worth probably over $1 billion. Uh, but as I point out in my book, they're not they're not worth $1 billion, right? They're not even priceless. They're worthless. And that sounds callous to say, but for everybody except the museum, they're worthless. They can't be negotiated. There's no monetary value to them. And so that's why it's always been, it's always been our goal, is to get the paintings back to the museum. So, and that's what the book talks about.
Well, that's amazing. Can't wait to read the book, and I'll put a link to the book in the
Oh, thank
comments,
you.
so the audience can also look in the book. Uh, Jeff, at the end, I always ask my guests, what is a watch collector for you? But to you, I want to ask, what is a collector in general to you?
What is a collector? You're catching me off guard on this, but I will say there are certain objects that we have, uh, to which we have a visceral attraction, and you look at it and you're just like, I just feel like I have to have that, and that's really what the collector is to try and possess those items that you just feel like you have to have. And it's a tremendous amount of satisfaction when you have it. Like I have a small watch collection. I love watches. In fact, this is my favorite one here, which I always keep by me. This was that was my grandfather's watch. My grandfather, for anybody that follows Premier League football, my grandfather was the first manager of Everton Football Club. It's a big thing in our family. And when he retired from Everton Football Club, that was his retirement gift, which was that watch. So it's a very special watch. But that, to me, kind of sums up what a collector is. There's people that um, collect things for an investment, but when I think about a collector, I'm not thinking about an investor. I'm thinking about somebody who just sees something, and just feels like they want to have it. They want to be able to experience it and wear it or look at it whenever they want. So,
And I didn't want to lose the opportunity to ask this question to someone who had, I'm sure, a lot of encounters with collectors that have collected very good art pieces. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Jeff. This has been such a great conversation.
thank you, Eddie.
Thank
I
you for
really enjoyed it.
appreciate it. Have a very nice day.
You too. Thanks very much. Have a good night.